Welcome to this video remembering Cragg Hall, the story of Cragg Vale's own mini stately home that was destroyed by a devastating fire on the 11th of August 1921. The video is brought to you by Cragg Vale Local History Group. My name is Shirley Daniel and I'm one of the founding members of the History Group. Back in 2018, the History Group made the decision to mark the 800th anniversary of this powerful event, with the aim of recognising and preserving this aspect of the area's rich history that in the intervening years had faded from general awareness and knowledge, even though it had played such a significant part in the life of the local and surrounding areas, and was a symbol of a period of much historical interest for Cragg Vale, namely the growth of the cotton industry. On the 12th of August 1921, news spread of the tragic event that had the previous day destroyed one of Cragg Vale's most iconic buildings. Crowds gathered in hushed disbelief at the still smoking and smouldering blackened ruin, a few gable ends sticking up gauntly into the sky. The story of Cragg Hall begins, as does so much of Cragg Vale's history, with the Hinchliffes, a large and industrious family, arguably the biggest influence on Cragg during and after the Industrial Revolution, and in particular with Hinchliffe, the last male in a line of prolific and influential mill owners. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Elphin Valley had no main road. To the west was the sparsely populated township of Errington, and to the east the parish of Sowerby. Habitation was on the hilltops, which were crisscrossed with pathways connecting to ancient packhorse routes. These were the busy main arteries for trade. Before the Peace Hall opened on the 1st of January 1779, wool was traded locally at the Hepton Store Cloth Hall and various places in Halifax. The trade in wool was mainly to the east of the Pennines and into Europe. Later, as the cotton trade developed, raw cotton began to arrive by the port of Liverpool in the west and was transported into the Pennines for manufacture. Manchester became the centre for cotton trading. Life was tough going for our hilltop farmers and their families, toiling for a subsistence living on their small patch of land. These men, women and children had over the years developed additional skills of the weaving trade to supplement their incomes. Wool was the raw material, and high-quality, hard-wearing worsted was the cloth produced, all by hand. By the 18th century, Britain had become the world's leading commercial nation, controlling a global trading empire. The Industrial Revolution, a major turning point in history, had its beginnings in Great Britain. And it was at this time that one Samuel Hinchliffe, son of a well-to-do clothier from Pudsey, married the daughter of Richard Thomas, a landowner from Sowerby, and set up as a maltster at Hawksclough near Mythenroyd, where his son Richard was born in 1750. As a youth, Richard worked with his father, but later became landlord of the Blue Pits Inn in Rochdale. This was a time of great innovation. The demand for cloth was growing rapidly, and men such as Hargreaves, Arkwright and Crompton were to revolutionise and mechanise the textile industry with their cotton processing inventions. But machines need power, and before the steam engine was perfected as a motive force, the power of the rivers was of prime importance, especially in the Pennines in our local valleys. With his family background in textiles, Samuel's son Richard was intrigued by these cotton spinning frames, and having inherited some land from his maternal grandmother at Washfold, near the top of Turving Clough above Cragg, where there was a good fall of water, he returned with his family in about 1785 to settle in Sowerby. At Washfold, he built a small water-powered cotton spinning mill, the first of the 11 mills that thrived in the valley from the 1780s to the 1930s. And talking about thriving, Richard and his wife had 11 children, most of whom survived into their 70s or 80s. With most of his 6 sons and 5 daughters as his early workforce, and with the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution's development of trade and rise of businesses, it is no wonder that Richard's projects prospered. He was obviously very entrepreneurial, not afraid to take risks along the way, and there's no doubt that he and his children exploited the opportunities of the new cotton trade. At the time of his death in 1817, the family had built or acquired properties including 4 mills, 2 farms, 2 grocery shops, cottages, and the Robin pub. The list continued to grow over the next decade as 2 more mills and numerous cottages were built, homes for the expanding workforce, as people seeking new opportunities for employment began to embrace the Industrial Revolution and moved into the valley to work in the mills. Joseph Hinchliffe, one of Richard's sons, continued in the family business, but also branched out on his own behalf. He lived here at Marsh Grove, opposite the Hinchliffe Arms, and this was where his son Hinchliffe was born in 1823. Sadly, Hinchliffe mother never fully recovered from the birth of her child and died in 1824. It has been said that it was his mother's money, inherited on her death, that enabled Hinchliffe's father to set him up in business in his own right, by redeeming for him the previously mortgaged Rudcliffe Mill, the foundation from which Hinchliffe grew his fortune. Not a bad 21st birthday present. Certainly, in 1855, aged 31, he was able to purchase the Marshaw Bridge estate, the extent of which can be seen outlined blue in this plan of the time, which came with sole water rights and water supply, securing the future of the 2 mills in the Withens Valley. Outlined in red is the Cragg Hall estate, which he purchased 6 months later, complete with the 17th century Cragg Hall, often referred to as the original manor house of Craggvale, and, according to the deeds, cottages, coach houses, barns, stables, pleasure grounds, gardens and yard, plus most of the hillside. Hinchliffe and his wife of 9 years, Fanny, moved in 1855 to Cragg Hall with 4 of their eventual 5 children, aged from 2 to 6 years old. Through the 1860s and the bleak cotton famine years brought about by the American Civil War, when lack of raw cotton forced most cotton mills to close, Hinchliffe and the other Cragg mill owners achieved the survival both of their Craggvale mills and of their employees, albeit at subsistence levels, setting them to build high dry stone walls around their estate fields when the mills were quiet. So well built were these cotton famine walls that many are still in good condition today. In the 1870s, Hinchliffe continued to expand his ownership of mills with the acquisition of Four Gates End and Victoria Mills, in effect becoming custodian of all the dynasty wealth. At the end of the 1870s, whether the family had outgrown Cragg Hall or were looking for a more comfortable home with modern amenities, a new, larger but typically late Victorian house was being built a couple of fields down the hillside from the old Cragg Hall, on part of the estate Hinchliffe had bought from his cousin George in 1855. Hinchliffe, now a JP, was very much a Yorkshire Victorian, as his new home reflected, with its almost plain medieval revival style, quite popular towards the end of the 19th century, in contradiction to the elaborate Gothic castles or classical villas favoured by the wealthy mid-Victorians. The 1894 Ordnance Survey map shows this dwelling, roughly square on plan, probably with 4 main downstairs rooms and an entrance hall with a staircase to the first floor. This building is about 1/3 the size and bears very little resemblance to the one that was destroyed by fire, as you'll see later. By 1880, Hinchliffe, Fanny, and their 4 adult children had moved into the new house, naming it Cragg Hall, and their old home, Old Cragg Hall, which it still is today. In spite of his wealth, Hinchliffe didn't believe in the trappings of society and lived a relatively austere life. Some would call him mean, parsimonious, stingy. Others, thrifty and careful with money. But St John's Church, Halifax Infirmary, and many other local institutions could testify to the family's generosity, from which they had all benefited greatly. He was a hard worker, and also a hard taskmaster, but even-handed, instilling in his own sons the need to toe the same line as his workers, leading by example. They had to be at the mill with their employees when the wheels started to turn at 6 a.m., take their turn at all operations, no matter how disagreeable, and they had to stay until the last of their workers had left the factory and the mill had been locked up. As a businessman, Hinchliffe was very successful. Notably, the vast amount of his wealth was not made out of cotton. Over time, he had made various shrewd investments. One such of note was his purchase for £30,000, and with unerring timing, just right for development, much of the land on which the town of Littleborough now stands. Also, there were shares in British and American railway stocks, and properties in Harrogate and likely in Southport. But not even Hinchliffe's wealth could guarantee family happiness, and the history records reveal a catalogue of heartache. It seems the family's future was jinxed. Their third son, Howard, had died in 1855, aged 4. Frederick, the second son, died aged 32 in 1880 in Australia, where he had been sent to recuperate from illness. In 1883, daughter Clara, prescribed a change of air for her illness, died in Bournemouth aged 27. In 1886, Hinchliffe's oldest son, Charles, died aged 39 and was buried in Menton, France. His body later exhumed to be placed in the family vault in Cragg Vale. Frederick, Clara, and Charles were all victims of tuberculosis, often called consumption, which was rife at the time. The prevalence of many cousins marrying cousins within 2 generations of this large family is very noticeable in the family tree. One wonders if this may have contributed to hereditary weaknesses, which predisposed so many of the Hinchliffes to fall victim to tuberculosis. Helen was the only child to survive and subsequently outlive her parents. She was described as robust, headstrong, and making up in vitality for all that was lacking in her ailing brothers and sister. It is said that in his later years her father spoilt his now only child, but this didn't prevent her being troublesome to him, as in 1881, at the age of 27, without her father's consent and against his wishes, she eloped to Burnley and in true storybook fashion disclaimed the family riches to marry the man she loved, cotton machine maker George Sager. Alas for Helen, her husband lived only 2 more years, dying in Southport in 1883. He was not favoured with a place in the family vault, his headstone being placed behind St John's Church, where Helen was often to be seen mourning his loss. A year later, however, a happier occasion. Helen had moved on. Her father, thinking he'd talked a bit of sense into her, she was married a second time to a widower almost 20 years her senior, Dr. Edmund Strickland from Kirby Moorside, a well-to-do physician and surgeon practicing then in Halifax and later in Southport. 4 years later, in 1888, Hinchliffe lost his wife Fanny, to become a widower and the only occupant, apart from his housekeeper, of a house built less than 10 years earlier for a family of 6. He became somewhat of a recluse, rarely venturing out from home, and leaving his half-cousin Thomas Edwin Hinchliffe to manage his mills. His wife's death now prompted Hinchliffe to write a will in which personal possessions, household effects, horses and carriages, and £2,000 were to be left to Helen. Thomas Edwin was to inherit Churchbank Mill and £5,000. But the chief beneficiary to his estate, including Victoria, Vale and Upper Mills, cottages and £10,000, was to be his nephew Richard, thus ensuring the continuation of the Hinchliffe cotton dynasty. However, this was not to be, on two counts. Firstly, within 2 years, the will would have lapsed when Richard died in a railway accident. Secondly, and most astonishingly, this will wasn't found until around 1960, amongst refuse from clearance of a building previously used by solicitors, Messrs. Sutcliffe's Hebden Bridge. A serious occupational hazard of cotton and woolen mills was fire, and in the Januaries of 1896 and 1900 respectively, disastrous fires destroyed Vale and Upper Mills. These two losses and his advancing years took their toll on Hinchliffe, resulting in Helen and Edmund Strickland taking him to their home in Duncombe Lodge, Southport, where he could be given special care. Of course, there were some doubting Thomases at the time who questioned Helen's motives, saying she intended to be sure, as her father's prospective sole beneficiary, that any new will her father might write would not be to her disadvantage. This is the only photo of him known to exist, said to have been taken posthumously of him in his coffin. He had survived only 7 more months, dying on the 8th of October 1900, and was interred in the family vault in the churchyard of St John in the Wilderness, Cragg Vale, just a few hundred yards from where he was born 77 years earlier. Helen wasted no time in improving the family home. Soon after her father's death and in his memory, Helen and Dr. Strickland paid for a substantial tower, 30 foot square, 106 feet high, with 8 bells, to be built at St Emmanuel Church, Southport, still ringing today, and had plans approved for a new Cragg Vale vicarage, which was built in 1901 and legally conveyed to the Ecclesiastical Commissioners on the 15th of January 1904. Plans were also passed in 1900 for new stabling and garaging for the hall, but these weren't built until later. On the 24th of February 1902, at the age of 49, Helen was widowed for the second time, her husband Dr. Strickland being buried in the family vault. The last few paragraphs of this story seem to have been all doom and gloom, but the next chapter could not be more of a contrast. The fashionable spa town of Harrogate, with its new winter gardens, opened in 1898, was, as still today, a favourite resort for the well-to-do, and the Hinchliffes were frequent visitors there, possibly staying with a school friend of Helen's from Halifax, Laura Popplewell, who had bought a house in the fashionable Cornwall Road area when her husband died, and lived there with her mother, Ada Lascelles, who had been almost a second mother to Helen after her mother's death. Laura and her mother took in lodgers, one of whom, from 1901, was a handsome 21-year-old bank clerk named William Algernon Simpson. Born in October 1880, he was the son of a gentleman farmer at a 70-acre Simpson's Farm, Skipwith, near Selby, and was educated at Wharfdale College, Boston Spa. It's more than likely that it was Laura who introduced Helen and William on one of Helen's visits to Harrogate. The couple kept their growing relationship secret, even when, on the 12th of August 1902, they were married at St Mary's Church, Harrogate. Now, whether a clerical error or Helen wishing to lessen the age gap between them, her age on the marriage certificate is 40, not 49. The couple hyphenated Helen's maiden name to their title to become Mr. and Mrs. Simpson Hinchliffe. And as the country progressed through the changes of the new Edwardian era after the death of Queen Victoria, so in Cragg Vale with this marriage, the stage was set for an immediate change of nature and character, affecting almost every sphere of village life. As well as a not inconsiderable sum left by her second husband, £25,243 according to probate records, about 2 million in today's money, and in the apparent absence of a Hinchliffe will, Helen had been declared her father's sole beneficiary, inheriting his reputed fortune of £325,000, some 28 million today. In the early days, this caused her some problems, as she was not too skillful in managing her wealth. However, with her new husband's support, she began to make use of it. In September of that year, whilst their marriage was still secret, came the first step in transforming the hall into a stately home, when plans were approved for a gatehouse, to a design by architect Edgar Wood, said to be one of the most advanced English architects of his generation. Its pointed Gothic archway making a formal entrance into the grounds, as the couple introduced a new social era to the village. Possibly the most memorable, because there had been nothing like it in living memory, if ever, was Christmas 1902, when, to celebrate their newly disclosed marriage, a round of festivities for the children, work people, tenants and old folk was organised. For the children there was entertainment in the Sunday school, with a special tea followed by a visit from Father Christmas, alias Mr. Simpson Hinchliffe, who, to the delight of the children, handed out toys to all from a huge Christmas tree. Although not in the planning was Santa's beard catching fire from the candles on the tree. The tenants and mill employees, 150 in all, were treated to a sumptuous meal in the Sportsman's Inn, surpassing anything given in Cragg before: soup, oxtail and hare, turbot and lobster sauce, cod and oyster sauce, joints of beef, veal, mutton, turkey and ham, capons, roast goose and apple sauce, Christmas pudding, mince pie, apple tart, jellies and cream, cheese and celery, accompanied by a plentiful supply of drink. And the couple let it be known they were determined to do whatever they could to benefit Cragg and its people, to provide them with work and amenities for welfare and leisure. Very soon the mills were updated and new machinery installed under the watchful eye of Thomas Edwin, and the couple embarked over the next few years on an ambitious programme of enlarging, rebuilding and refurnishing Cragg Hall. Plans don't identify all the architects at each stage, but we do know that renowned designer and craftsman G. Faulkner Armitage was responsible for the furnishing and decoration of many substantial private homes throughout the country, was very much involved. First to be added, almost doubling the footprint of the house, was a large, more formal single-storey extension built on the northeastern end of the house, with a little entrance porch at one end and a tall chimney stack in the gable. Plans for these additions, including a large billiard room — any gentleman of note has a billiard room in his home — and offices to the rear, were approved in July 1903. However, within 2 years, this no longer seemed adequate. Now, a major redevelopment, resulting in a very different looking building, was proposed. The earlier single-storey extension gained an extra storey with an elaborate central tower at the front and rooms at the back. Dormer windows above provided light for bedrooms and apartments, all fitted up in the most elaborate fashion, according to descriptions of the time. And to the rear of the house were kitchen, back staircase and staff accommodation. To the front of the older house was added an ornate 2-storey porte cochere of highly decorative stonework, a contrasting tower which, with 3 sides open on the ground floor, gave an impressive entrance to the building, You could step from your coach or car to the hall under cover. Immediately to the right of this, new mullioned and transomed windows with an imposing Dutch gable above gave the front of the building a new look. But the most extensive additions beyond the porch were 3 more large rooms, a dining room at the rear, and at the front a central hall, complete with grand staircase for use of family and guests. Also a drawing room, which gave access to the Edwardian conservatory. Following the work to the main structure of the house, several smaller buildings were added to the estate. An accumulator house providing electric light, very modern innovation. It was 1940 before the Yorkshire Electricity Board brought power up Cragg Vale. An ice house, partly below ground, and a coal store, with some elaborate embellishments such as castellations, arched doorways and mullioned windows, and features similar to the 1902 Arts and Crafts Gatehouse standing astride the driveway, although the original pointed Gothic archway altered to its present shape, possibly in 1906, the date on the gateway, to accommodate larger coaches and motor vehicles. It is likely that Mr. Simpson Hinchliffe, or Algy as he became known, was the first person to introduce the motor car to Cragg. It's on record that in 1905 he fell foul of the Malton Trap, a notorious speed trap on the Scarborough Road, and was fined £3 for driving along at the excessive speed of 26 miles 828 yards per hour. The stable block, originally planned in 1900, was now built in a different location, and to emphasize the family's modernity, in 1906 it was extended to include a motor garage. In 1910, 2 cottages were built on the site of the former terrace Cuddywood. They were named Broadwood after Algy's show-winning horse. 2 further cottages, homes for some of the staff, and a laundry were planned in 1912. However, only the cottages were built. They were named Moorside after another of Algy's successful horses. In this same year, Helen purchased the Cragg Vale Inn, renaming it the Hinchliffe Arms. And to round off the changes, in 1914 plans were prepared for a new entrance to the business room at the rear and a bay window on the east gable. Splendid ornamental terraced gardens with striking architectural features were established. A tree-lined driveway with turrets in front of the house, complete with spiral staircases, down to a parterre or formal garden with fountain, sundial, tennis court, stone steps with carved balustrades, and a further cast-iron spiral staircase to a croquet lawn, pergola, and hothouse. We can't be sure what was grown in this, except that vines definitely featured. We have a newspaper account of a man convicted of breaking in to steal grapes. Interestingly, some of these structures were built partially in concrete, another innovative feature of the time. 2 streams ran from the top of the grounds, one to the left of the house down a waterfall, which fed into a tiled bathing pool before flowing into a boating lake behind the Hinchliffe Arms, believed to be the original Marshaw Bridge Dam. And the other to the right of the house ran down to the river, passing a greenhouse, potting shed and boiler house. In 1907, when the bulk of the work was completed, the Simpson Hinchliffes invited their staff and mill workers to a celebration garden party. And here they all are in this magnificent photo, all 197 of them, resplendent in their Sunday best. And zooming in, we see Helen and Algy with Laura Popplewell, and not forgetting Helen's dog. Sadly, very few photos have survived, and we have yet to find any of the house interior. But this actual ground floor plan shows how the rooms were set out. It must have been a sight to behold. Records tell that no expense was spared in securing the finest possible materials. Practically every room was panelled in oak, the woodwork throughout also oak, all richly carved and highly polished and waxed. These photos of interiors of Whitewick Manor, built in the same period, may give a clue. And if we zoom in to compare windows, the similarity is quite striking. The whole was splendidly furnished and filled with precious artifacts and paintings, 4 or 5 of national importance, valued then at about 16,000, and furniture imported from the continent. The house was acclaimed as one of the finest mansions in Yorkshire, a spectacular building, memorable for its uniqueness, impossible to label as it incorporated so many different styles: Gothic, medieval revival, French chateau, Baroque, arts and crafts, Edwardian. Helen and Algy continued to spend lavishly, and not just on themselves. Their gifts, often large and numerous, were widespread. They were proving to be generous benefactors and took a prominent part in the public and social life of the Upper Calder Valley. They were largely responsible for the first Church Institute, complete with billiard table, and the Working Men's Club at Bankview, sometimes hosting concerts in aid of funds. Helen's concern was for the well-being of residents. She employed a nurse to provide health care, and newspapers of the time reported eagerly on tea parties, picnics for the workers, events for schools and clubs, and local residents were regularly welcomed into the grounds. Algy dabbled in politics, standing as candidate for the Unionist Party in the Sowerby constituency in several elections from 1904, mainly unsuccessfully. He became a JP for West Riding, supporter and president of Halifax Infirmary. His greatest interests were local sports and farming, president of Hebden Bridge and Calder Valley Agricultural Society, supporter of Cragg Cricket Club, keen angler, shooter, and keeping of racing pigeons. There is a story that he used to take his pigeons in his rolls up to the White House, where he would release them, then try to race them home. But one day he definitely beat more than a few of them home when Tommy Rat, the moor gamekeeper, mistook them for feral pigeons and shot them. He managed the estate farms, Cragg Hall, Hilltop and Banktop, and was a horse breeder of renown. His horses were stabled at Harrogate, probably close to where his groom William Least lived, by the Stray, ideal for exercising horses. Broadwood, Algy's most successful hunter, won the national championship 5 years in succession, and in 1909 was champion hunter at the International Horse Show Olympia, where Algy was presented to Queen Alexandra, not his first meeting with royalty, as in 1907 he had been presented to King Edward VII by Reverend Bourchier, vicar of Hebden Bridge. Alongside all this daily activity, Cragg Hall became the centre for entertaining on a lavish scale, with many social events and visiting celebrities. Renowned contralto Dame Clara Butt, esteemed Shakespearean actor Henry Ainley, even the 6 times world billiard champion Melbourne Inman, during whose stay Algy played at a game of billiards after plying him with drinks, and was always thereafter able to tell the tale of beating the champion. Helen and Algy also travelled widely both in Britain and abroad, and so, with Cragg Hall as the hub, this new social era, so opposite to what the village had been used to, continued for the next 8 years, until international events brought changes of a different nature, as war was declared on the 4th of August 1914. Algy was, at first, a member of the local tribunal, hearing applications for exemption from conscription, but he was uncomfortable with this work. So, purchasing his own ambulance, he joined the forces and was attached to the French Red Cross Society on the Verdun front, finally in 1918 serving as temporary second lieutenant in the Army Service Corps. At home, Helen became one of the motivators for an auxiliary hospital for wounded soldiers opened in October 1916 at Castle Hall, Craigvale. 2.5 years after the beginning of the war, Helen, not in the best of health in recent years, left home for Bournemouth, hoping for recuperation in the sea air, but sadly never reached the south coast. She was taken suddenly and seriously ill whilst passing through London, and died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the Carlton Hotel, Pall Mall, on the 19th of April, 1917. Algy was with her. About 500 people attended her funeral on the 24th of April, the wounded troops lining the church path. A newspaper report of the day began. The day was typical of all that is best in springtime, the sun shining continuously from a cloudless sky. It seemed as if nature, too, had a tribute to pay to one whose kindliness and thoughtfulness had endeared her to those in lower stations of life, and whose benefactions indeed have been largely the means of keeping Craigvale alive. The scene was one of saddened beauty and grandeur. The whole of the valley came to a standstill to mourn the loss of the lady who, through her kindness and generosity, had had such an impact on their lives. The large Hinchliffe tomb with the angel above was opened for the very last time for her coffin to be placed inside. There were several personal legacies in Helen's will to close friends and family and to loyal staff, the bulk of her estate being left to her husband. Although the armistice was signed in November 1918, it was some time before life began to settle. The long-term effects on the economy made it difficult for all, with no return to pre-war days. Algy continued to live at Cragg Hall. He still supported many local organisations and continued to entertain, but on nowhere near the same scale. August 1921, however, was special. The summer of 1921 had seen one of the longest dry and very warm spells on record, and Cragg Hall was given extra cleaning and polishing, all was being made ready for entertaining visitors for the glorious 12th. But just after midnight on the 11th of August, on his return from Halifax, Algy sat down to a light supper and some urgent correspondence in the billiard room when he became aware of the smell of burning. He at once went into the hall to find it full of smoke, and realizing the imminent danger, rushed to rescue the two maids, the only staff on duty, who were in their rooms on the top floor. As he helped them out onto the lawn, in the nick of time, the west wing of the house burst into flames, and the upper rooms filled with fumes. At 12:20, he tried for 1/4 to alert the fire brigade, but his calls went unanswered. Frantically, he rang the estate alarm. House staff, grooms, gardeners, locals came running from nearby homes, but the heat was too intense for them to salvage any but a few furnishings and valuables. Hydrants had been installed at each corner of the garden, but because of the drought, the spring water was running very slowly, and the supply was soon exhausted, leaving the hall's firefighting equipment useless. Durdy, the chauffeur, was dispatched in the fastest car to Hebden Bridge. The brigade there received the call at 1:25 a.m. and set off as soon as their buzzer had assembled enough men to man the horse tender, while at the same time a message was sent to the Halifax brigade, who immediately turned out with their latest motor engine, arriving on the scene just before the horse tender at 2:10 a.m. The sight was an awful one. The night was pitch black and still, the fire blazed and roared like a furnace, and the whole countryside was lit up as by day. Every available length of hose was coupled to the engine by the river at the Hinchliffe Arms to pump water 500 yards uphill across the gardens to the hall. It was 3 a.m. before the jets could be put on, with some apparent success, But just as the men thought they stood a chance of saving the east wing, a huge block of masonry fell directly onto the hose, destroying it. After that, there was no chance for the building. Within a few short hours, it was nothing but a blackened ruin, roofless gables outlined starkly against the sky. As dawn broke, too late, the heavens opened and a torrential rainstorm began. Apart from the fine gatehouse and the stable block, all that remained was a scene of desolation, gaunt and broken walls, debris strewn around. This destruction of the mansion brought vast numbers of sightseers, expressing sympathy for its popular owner, whose grief was not only for the loss of his beautiful home, but also the historic family associations of the place. After the fire, Algy moved to his wife's childhood home, Old Cragg Hall, which since the death of Thomas Edwin Hinchliffe had been occupied by farm managers. The disaster had focused his mind on the future of Cragg Vale, so he set about forming a cotton syndicate to ensure the survival of the mills and their employees, and to keep the village alive. Algy would retain an interest, and the syndicate, embracing the three mills, Victoria, Churchbank and Turvin, Hinchliffe Arms, Cragg Hall ruins and cottages, a large slice of the estate, would keep the old family name of Messrs. Hinchliffe and Sons Limited. He continued his interest in politics, being elected MP for Sorby in 1922, and enjoyed his time at Westminster, giving his MP's salary to organisations he supported locally. Unfortunately, at a by-election 1 year later, he lost the seat, but in recognition of his work was made president of Salisbury Division Conservative Association. Nevertheless, the loss of his seat was a bitter blow, and this, and the lack of social life he'd been used to, paved the way for his departure from Cragg Vale in 1926 to live at Wetherby Grange, Wetherby, where, for the next few years, he involved himself in agriculture and stock breeding on a large scale, and apparently also in social life. In January 1928, one newspaper listed W. Simpson Hinchliffe and Party, Wetherby Grange, among guests at the Bramham Hunt Ball, also attended by Princess Mary. Algy later purchased Dale Side, Leeds Road, Harrogate, a large, well-appointed gentleman's residence, with entrance lodge, stable, garage, greenhouse, kitchen garden, cottages in 2 or 3 acres. Before and after World War II, he made visits to Egypt, India, Japan and South Africa, and during the war and for the rest of his life, lived in one of the cottages at Daleside, having let his main residence to the government. It was an unfortunate coincidence that Algy left Cragg Vale when trading conditions began to worsen. Coupled with post-World War I recession and the decline of the cotton trade, the next 10 years were bleak for Cragg. The remaining mills had all closed by 1933. In 1927, the syndicate had been forced to offer for sale by auction the Cragg Hall estate. All land, ruins, houses, stables, garages, gardens, lodge and woodlands, but after catastrophic bids, had been forced to withdraw all but Broadwood, which sold to its tenant. 7 years later, in January 1934, Algy sold Old Cragg Hall estate, including the Old Cragg Hall and Hilltop Farms, to the tenant since 1927, J.W. Sutcliffe, who in the same year also purchased the Cragg Hall estate, which had failed to sell in 1927. James William Sutcliffe was born in 1885 at Wadsworth, Hebden Bridge. On leaving school, he joined the staff of a local bank, but after World War I, joined his father Samuel, carrying out work all over the country in the family business of Messrs. S. Sutcliffe and Son, tar sprayers and road constructional contractors, which earned him the somewhat irreverent title of Tar Billy, used even to this day. In 1920, he married Mary Ellen Greenwood, and throughout his life was involved in a host of public and semi-public organisations: Mythenroyd UDC, School Governor, Hebden Bridge and Mythenroyd Gas Board, local hospital committees, Mythenroyd Musical Society, Cragg Vale and Mythenroyd Band, RNLI, Hebden Bridge Male Voice Choir, JP, active congregant and church warden at St John's and St Michael's Mythenroyd, where you can see this stained glass window to his memory. In local and county circles, he was both respected and feared, outspoken and critical, but forthright and constructive, intolerant of what he saw as waste and inefficiency in public service, but in private life genial, kind and generous. He developed the grounds of the ruined hall as a market garden, part of the war effort, and in the footsteps of Helen and Algie was always ready to open the grounds for garden parties and other social events, including this wedding. With his unexpected death in January 1953, the Upper Calder Valley lost one of its most outstanding personalities and representatives. William and his wife Mary's son Philip was born at Woodville, Cragg Vale, in 1923. Philip was a boarder at Giggleswick School, then at the beginning of World War II joined the Army Signals Corps, serving in North Africa, later at Monte Cassino, and finally in Austria. On his return, he joined the family business, married Pamela in 1947, and lived at Cragg Royd, part of the original Cragg Hall stable block, overlooking what was left of Cragg Hall ruin, and where their first two daughters were born. In 1958, the couple began to build a house on the footprint of the ruin and moved in 1959 into New Cragg Hall, where their third daughter was born. Truly, phoenix rising from the ashes. In 1960, Algie, although now an infrequent visitor to Cragg Vale, drawn maybe once a decade to the old Hinchliffe family home, Marsh Grove, which, together with Moorside cottages he still owned, accepted Mr. and Mrs. Sutcliffe's invitation to see New Cragg Hall on what proved to be his last visit to Cragg. 3 years later, on the 9th of June 1963, the Yorkshire Post announced his death after a painful illness bravely borne. Cragg Vale was in his heart to the end. On the 19th of June, his chauffeur and parlourmaid carried out his last wishes of a private funeral, no flowers, no memorial, and my ashes scattered to the four winds of heaven on Blackstone Edge Moor. It was ironic that just 10 days later, Cragg Hall grounds played host to a large crowd at a gala event to celebrate the opening of the new Cragg Vale Tennis Club on Cragg Hall's former rose garden, made available by Mr. and Mrs. Philip Sutcliffe after St John's Tennis Club had lost their grounds. The late 1960s brought about another transformation to the new Cragg Hall estate when the Sutcliffe family moved to Halifax. The woodland was gifted to Calder Civic Trust. The house, stable block and cottages sold, together with the grounds divided into the plots where houses now stand. Parts of the beautiful gardens still survive. The terraces, steps, towers, waterfall, all remain hidden in the trees, creating a delightful setting for today's private community, with the gatehouse at its entrance still fulfilling its original purpose. Memories of Cragg Hall, its history and unhappy demise, have faded into scant awareness, even though in its day it was a huge part of local life, a legacy of the growth and decline of the Cragg Vale mill industry when cotton was king. The centenary of that disastrous fire seems a fitting opportunity to redress the balance, to look back and lay to rest the myths and misconceptions, and rediscover the real story of Cragg Hall, Cragg Vale's stately home.